Introduction: People's Republic of Hawaii. Across the top of a two-page spread in its June 16, 1997 issue, Forbes magazine declared, "The People's Republic of Hawaii." This conservative journal of the economic elite bemoaned what it deemed to be an environment inhospitable to business. At a time when even former socialist countries are going the free enterprise route, this small part of the U.S. remains mired in a half-baked form of socialism. Lubov, 1997. 70. The sins of this semi-socialist welfare state were many. Most of them stemmed from too much government and taxes. The state's annual budget comes to around $5,270 per Hawaiian sick. That compares with $2,980 in California. It amounts to almost 19% of the island's gross economic output. Under a law passed in 1974, employers must pay virtually all of workers' health insurance premiums. Add to this a workers' compensation system that presumes all injuries were caused on the job. Lubov, 1997. 67-68. The article took Hawaii to task for being far left of the mainstream in other areas as well. The journal feared that the state's judiciary would be amenable to demands of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. At the time, Hawaii also seemed to be on the verge of becoming the first state to permit same-sex marriages, stirring reactionary furor across the United States and prompting the passage of preemptive legislations in Congress and 29 states. 1 Forbes could have run off a much longer list to paint the islands red. Hawaii instituted the first negative income tax program for the poor. Thompson, 1966. 29. It was the first state to legalize abortion and to ratify the ultimately failed Equal Rights Amendment. It led in abolishing the death penalty. Hawaii was the first state to mandate prepaid health care for workers, and its workers' compensation program has had the highest payout rates. As of 1970, Hawaii was the only state with an unemployment compensation program covering agricultural workers and one of only 5 states providing temporary disability insurance for illnesses or accidents unrelated to the job. Citizens of Hawaii have continually voted overwhelmingly for Democrats, and Hawaii's Democrats have been among the most leftward-leaning. 2 For example, in the 2004 Democratic primaries, Dennis Kucinich, the presidential candidate on the left fringe of the party, garnered 31% of the votes in Hawaii, nearly doubling the figures for Maine, Minnesota, and Oregon, the only other so-called blue states in which he scored double digits. 3 While not without serious limitations, like the eventual rejection of same-sex marriage, resistance to Hawaiian sovereignty, and the Democrats' entrenched ties to wealth and power, Hawaii's politics have been arguably the most progressive in the country. What may be even more striking about Hawaii's relatively progressive politics is its sharp break in the 1940s and 1950s with a long, resolutely conservative past. Few other states or regions, if any, have traversed the political spectrum so far and so quickly. For example, increasingly dominated by a small group of Haʻole for-sugar capitalists of mostly U.S., English, and German origins, the Kingdom of Hawaii until 1893 and, following the illegal overthrow of the monarchy, the Republic of Hawaii 1894-1898 sanctioned and enforced a system of indentured labor for a half-century, until the U.S. territorialization of the islands in 1900.5. The dearth of democracy, however, lasted for almost another half-century, as the small group of Haʻole sugar capitalists continued to wield virtually unfettered control over the territory's economy and politics, the latter unwaveringly through the Republican Party. Given its long conservative past, how did Hawaii remake itself into one of the most democratic social formations in the United States? Hawaii's working class provides a necessary and essential part of the answer. Beginning in the late 1930s but not gaining much momentum until the end of World War II, the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union (ILWU) organized the island's sugar, pineapple, and stevedoring industries, representing the vast majority of Hawaii's organized labor and becoming the generally recognized voice for the working class as a whole. 6 Leftist in its ideology and leadership, active both at the point of production and in politics, and unprecedentedly interracial, the ILWU embodied Hawaii's working class for itself. Reviewing the union's role in the swift leftward shift in Hawaii's politics, its regional director recounted in a 1968 speech, "As workers became conscious of their economic power, they began to recognize that they also had political power and exercised it successfully in cooperation with other liberal sections of the community to enact in Hawaii probably the best package of social and labor legislation of any state in the Union. 25 years ago we were one of the most backward communities in our nation." 7 Even the harshest critics of the ILWU concede grudgingly the union's vital role in the rapid democratization of Hawaii, objecting to the degree to which it has succeeded, not failed, in achieving its lofty goals. The mid-century coalescence of Hawaii's working class through the ILWU was not achieved easily. Before World War II, nobody had any realistic expectations that the workers would form a coherent, progressive social force in the foreseeable future. While employers may have feared it and the most ardent labor organizers may have aspired to it, neither anticipated the working class's actual formation in the 1940s. The employers' unremitting dominance and suppression of labor were important factors in the dismal state and prospects of pre-war workers. But, as scholars agree, the most crucial factor bridling working class formation before World War II was racial divisions. From the middle of the 19th century, native Hawaiians and migrant laborers recruited mainly from China, Portugal, Japan, and the Philippines, in overlapping succession, worked on Hawaii's sugar plantations. Following their initial contractual stints in the sugar industry, many of them moved on to work in Hawaii's other industries, including pineapple and longshoring. From U.S. annexation to World War II, there were several large-scale movements through which workers contested their poor pay and conditions and the employers' unmitigated, unilateral control. But the workers were divided racially. Then, toward the end of the war, they built, seemingly overnight, a lasting interracial movement. The protracted period of entrenched racial divisions, displaced by a protracted period of durable interracialism that continues to this day, points to the overarching research problem of this book: how to account for the historic formation of Hawaii's interracial labor movement. Reconceptualizing interracialism sociology is quiet, nearly silent, on the concept of interracialism, which I define as the ideology and practice of forming a political community across extant racial boundaries. 8 Instead, sociology speaks almost exclusively to racial divisions and conflicts. Despite the near silence, however, interracialism has long been present and indispensable. Since the decline of biologistic theories, a commonly shared but largely unspoken assumption has underpinned most sociological explanations of racial divisions and conflicts: the normative desirability of interracialism. A pervasive shadow presence, it functions as the analytically absent but epistemologically structuring desire. Kennedy and Galtz, 1996, 437. That is, sociology maintains its explicit focus on racial divisions and conflicts, while bracketing interracialism as something implicitly desired but rarely analyzed. A consequence of this somewhat peculiar situation is that interracialism is understood negatively, as necessitating deracialization. 9 In a world divided by race, interracialism happens only when race lessens in salience. Even the few studies that appear to redress this negativity through explicit analysis reproduce it. William Julius Wilson, 1999, for example, admirably aims to deal squarely with interracialism, analyzing and advocating the formation of interracial political communities mobilized against the ever-growing economic inequality in the United States. Because racial ideology distorts the real sources of our problems, building interracial coalitions requires an adequate understanding of the social, economic, and political conditions that cause racial ideology either to flourish or subside. Emphasizing and acting upon the race-neutral sources of inequality are the proposed keys to interracialism. Wilson 1999. 39, 7, ch. 3 Passam. In other words, interracialism entails deracialization. Wilson 1999 is hardly alone, though notably more explicit than most. Ever since the eclipse of biologistic theories of race by assimilationist ones, the same two notions concerning interracialism evident in Wilson have steadfastly held sway: that it is desirable and that it requires a retraction of race, in significance, if not in toto. From the early decades of the last century, assimilationist theorists constructed teleological explanations in which racial and ethnic conflicts and differences gave way inexorably to assimilation. As Robert E. Park 1926-1950, 150 wrote memorably, the race relations cycle which takes the form, to state it abstractly, of contacts, competition, accommodation and eventual assimilation, is apparently progressive and irreversible. Based, almost always, on an implicit, if not always precisely stated, hypothesis that trends will show a moderation of differences between ethnic populations, many have proceeded productively within a broadly assimilationist approach to the present. Hirschman 1983. 412, see also Niemanen 1997, Waters and Jimenez 2005. A common assumption of assimilationism is the normative desirability of assimilation, which is, in almost all cases, the formation of a unified nation unstratified and undivided by race and ethnicity. In other words, the imagining of a single, interracial political community coextensive with the nation-state. 10. The path toward its realization is an evolutionary, though at times conflictual, process of deracialization by which all within a nation would eventually become raceless in their outlook and actions, save for politically amorphous celebrations of multiculturalism and diversity. Although they developed in contradistinction to the assimilationist framework, more conflict-based approaches to race share similar assumptions concerning interracialism. A leading conflict-based alternative to assimilationism has been Marxist accounts of race. 11 Like their assimilationist counterparts, they share a largely unspoken desire for interracialism. A major difference is that the interracial political community to which Marxists aspire is not a unified nation but a unified working class in struggle against capital. Also, like the assimilationists, Marxists imply that interracialism is brought about by deracialization, as workers get beyond race and organize around their common class interests. This implication is made explicit in the important work of Terry Boswell, Cliff Brown, and John Brueggemann. 12 Like Wilson, 1999, they laudably recognize the dearth of scholarship on interracialism. But, also like Wilson, their willingness to address interracialism head-on steers them back to maintaining a racially negative conceptualization of it. Interracial working-class solidarity requires that both cheap and higher-priced labor give primacy to long-term, class-based interests. Brueggemann and Boswell 1998. 438 Presumably abandoning or holding in abeyance their short-term, race-based interests. Not surprisingly, given the study's ties to split labor market and political process theories, both of which have been criticized for objectivist biases, Omi and Wynant 1994, Goodwin and Jasper 1999, their account of the ideological dimension of interracialism remains underdeveloped. Racial ideologies matter when economic competition among workers corresponds to racial boundaries but do not figure centrally in structuring interracialism. Though boasting a more substantial empirical literature on working-class interracialism than sociology, labor history also offers little theoretical help in rethinking interracialism. The study of interracialism, and race more generally, was long premised on a dichotomous understanding of race and class that privileged the latter. More recently, labor historians have sought to move beyond that understanding, although the merits of this effort remain hotly debated in the field. Arneson 1998, Hill 1996. Regardless, even a sympathetic reviewer notes that the recent scholarship on interracial unionism, particularly with regard to the CIO unions, has been focused too narrowly on variants of the how racist, racially egalitarian were the unions. Question. Arneson 1998. 156 largely overlooking the related, less metrical, how problem of explaining the ideological formation of interracialism and the role of race in it. Perhaps we should not view the racially negative conceptualization of interracialism as a problem. After all, that forming a political community across extant racial boundaries would require deracialization seems intuitive. The scholarship on Hawaii's working class certainly provides little reason to gainsay this. There has long been a consensus that the interracial working class movement of the 1940s and 1950s presupposed deracialization. Seeing the historically unprecedented interracialism among the workers not as a phenomenon needing explicit analytical attention but as part of a general post-war trend toward racial democracy in Hawaii, the more liberal, assimilationist studies presume, but do not give a clear account of, the deracialization of the working class. The more Marxist-oriented studies tend to focus on the ILWU, casting it, most pivotally its leftist leadership, in the proverbial role of the vanguard of the proletariat. 13 There are two major weaknesses, one empirical and one theoretical, to the consensus concerning the deracialized conception of interracialism prevailing in the study of Hawaii's workers and sociology. Comparing the scholarship against the historical evidence reveals that a critical question has gone unasked. Did race in fact recede in significance for Hawaii's workers as they forged an interracial class solidarity? Current scholarship assumes that race receded in inverse relationship to the speedy ascendance of the working class movement, but the assumption turns out to be empirically flimsy. If Hawaii's working class interracialism had been predicated on deracialization, race should have faded from the workers' discursive and other practices. But this study's examination of primary sources demonstrates that race did not fade but instead took on altered meanings and practices. Theoretical developments on ideology and social change over the past few decades also cast doubt on deracialization as the apposite conceptual imagery for interracialism. Deracialization, whether gradual or sudden, implies a process toward an absence or insignificance of race. In the case of Hawaii's working class interracialism, the supposed deracialization of the class struggle entailed a seemingly straightforward retreat of racial ideology, replaced and partly actuated by a likewise straightforward diffusion of a color-blind, and hence more apter, true, class ideology advanced by the radical ILWU leadership. Accordingly, the workers' new class identity and politics bore ostensibly little or no relation to their old racial ones. But, more mindful of continuities, as well as discontinuities, in social change, even rapid and large-scale, social theorists argue variously against such clear-cut conceptual breaks in history, because the concepts by which experience is organized and communicated proceed from the received cultural scheme. Salins 1985. 151.14 Labor historians and sociologists of class, among others, bear out this notion, showing how workers' ideologies and practices derive from pre-existing ones. 15 In the sociology of race, Gramscian interventions, though not concerned with interracialism per se, point in a similar direction. Quoting Antonio Gramsci, Stuart Hall 1986. 23 writes, ideologies are not transformed or changed by replacing one whole, already formed, conception of the world with another, so much as by renovating and making critical an already existing activity. 16 Therefore, the construction of new racial ideologies and practices happens through rearticulation, building upon and breaking away from their cultural and political predecessors, Omi and Wynant 1994. 89, and recombining race with other categories of practice, Hall 1980. This theoretical development, if taken seriously, suggests an important implication for the study of interracialism. It should not be reduced to a process of deracialization. In the case of working-class interracialism, for example, rather than assuming race disappears from workers' discourse and practice, a more robust approach would be to analyze how workers, who perceive their interests in racially divided terms, come to re-articulate, rather than ineluctably disarticulate, race and class. In Hawaii, ideas of class advanced by the ILWU's leadership were decisive, but not in the straightforward manner that has been suggested. Rather than unilaterally displacing race, I argue that notions of class conflict were stretched and molded to reinterpret and rework race. In other words, this study contends that working-class interracialism, and interracialism more generally, involves a transformation of race. While deracialization may indeed be a possible dimension of this transformation, it is neither necessary nor exhaustive. Hawaii's working-class interracialism offers a compelling historical case involving a transformation of race without deracialization. In early 1944, the ILWU sent organizer Matt Meehan to Hawaii to report on and aid the major organizing campaign that had just begun. In a passage of a report he sent from Hawaii to the International in San Francisco, Meehan complained jokingly that he would not be able to file weekly reports, as required, because there were no competent stenographers. He continued, "You dictate in English and it comes out pidgin, so what the hell?" 17 Meehan's mock complaint about Hawaiian Creole English, the lingua franca of workers and of non-Haole more generally, provides an apt metaphor for Hawaii's working-class interracialism. If Meehan's dictations were a leftist class ideology, introduced and proselytized by radicalized militants, the stenographer's Creole rendering was its rearticulation in Hawaii, as it incorporated the workers' racialized concerns. 18 The resultant interracial working-class ideology was thereby an ideology of class that transformed and was transformed by race. It was through race, not its erasure, that Hawaii's interracial working class was made. Scope of the book. Since it does not always or even normally happen, under what circumstances do workers form a class? When are they likely to construct their collective interests to be distinct from or in opposition to those of the other classes, namely the capitalists? One factor that historians and sociologists find significant is the nature of employer response to workers' unionization efforts. When employers vigorously oppose the extension of economic citizenship to them, workers tend to embrace a more class-conscious orientation. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Hawaii's employers chose to fight unionization every step of the way, at great costs to themselves and at times with extreme force. Why and how? Chapter 2 identifies a key part of the answer in the high degree of capital concentration in a handful of corporations, commonly referred to as the Big Five, which enabled the employers to mobilize an uncompromising, collective opposition to the workers. Examining the period from the mid-1870s to the early 1930s, the chapter analyzes how concentration of capital, collective organization of employers, and employers' opposition to workers unfolded and changed over time. By the mid-1940s, in the face of continuing employer opposition, workers in the sugar, pineapple, and stevedoring industries cohered as a class. But, before the war, they did not mobilize against the employers interracially. The closest they came to doing so was a lengthy and bitter strike in the sugar industry in 1920, which displayed a glimmer of hope for working-class interracialism as a Japanese union and a Filipino union cooperated. However, the coalition proved to be fleeting, and the strike ended in the workers' defeat. This outcome inaugurated more than 2 decades of refractive racial divisions among Hawaii's workers. Japanese workers left the labor movement, not to return for 2.5 decades, and Portuguese workers continued to avoid class conflict. Only Filipino workers continued to struggle collectively in the 1920s and 1930s. Critiquing prevailing approaches, Chapter 3 proffers an alternative explanation for the working-class racial divisions of the pre-war period. I demonstrate that Portuguese, Japanese, and Filipino workers confronted racisms based on qualitatively different assumptions, which, in turn, had material effects on their placements in the racial order. Thus differentially constrained and enabled, they constructed divergent and conflicting interests in politics, further reinforcing the racial divisions. In the mid-1930s, the hope of an interracial working-class movement re-emerged with the organization of the ILWU in Hawaii. However, its pre-war progress was laborious and limited, as the employers continued to fight independent unionism. By the time of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the ILWU had gained fewer than 1,000 members, which, due to the imposition of martial law, declined over the next 2 years. Then, suddenly between 1944 and 1946, the ILWU's ranks expanded exponentially, taking in more than 30,000 new members. Chapter 4 shows that the ILWU movement's seemingly overnight success had long been in the making. From 1935 to the U.S. entry into World War II, two significant changes took place that, though not resulting in large immediate gains, fundamentally altered the field of class conflict: the workers' establishment of a lasting tie to the resurgent labor movement on the West Coast, most importantly through the ILWU, and the active intervention of the state, via the enforcement of the National Labor Relations Act. While martial law effectively shut down union activities, it also had the contrary, delayed effect of engendering labor organizing. Having suffered under military rule, Hawaii's workers, once released from martial law restrictions, rushed into the ILWU, which, due to its pre-war efforts, was in position to receive and mobilize them. Chapter 5 explores the development of the movement's working-class ideology, specifically its quintessential and unprecedented interracialism. To date, the only explanation given in the sociological and historical literatures has been that Hawaii's workers, aided by the ILWU's leftist leadership, realized the importance of acting as a class rather than as separate races. In short, the master narrative for the post-war working class has been one of sudden deracialization whereby class effaced and replaced race. Positing a revisionist thesis, I explain how race was transformed, rather than negated, through its rearticulation with class, rendering the workers' struggles for racial and class justice coincident and mutually reinforcing. In the concluding chapter, I pull together the main findings of the study and draw out their implications. Two origins of capital's contentious response to labor. In the preface to The Making of the English Working Class, E.P. Thompson, 1963. 9 offered his now classic definition of class. Class happens when some men, as a result of common experiences, inherited or shared, feel and articulate the identity of their interests as between themselves, and as against other men whose interests are different from, and usually opposed to, theirs. Hawaii's working class happened in the 1940s. Through the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, sugar, pineapple, and dock workers came to feel and articulate the identity of their interests, that were different from, and opposed to, their employers. But, as Thompson and many other students of labor history have noted, working class formation is a highly contingent affair. It does not always, or even usually, happen. How did it happen in Hawaii? Why did workers, across racial and industrial lines, conclude that they had common interests that conflicted with the interests of their employers? Part of the explanation lies with the employers, against whom the workers struggled and formed their identity. Corroborating common sense, studies find that workers adopt a more radical, class conflict orientation when their employers vigorously oppose the extension of economic citizenship. Eliel, 1949. 483-486, 488, Kameldorf, 1988, Lipset, 1983.1. In this regard, Hawaii provides a prototypical example.